Greetings, AP European History students. Your review from the top to bottom for Unit 13 on the Cold War to the fall of communism and the development of the European Union. What was the cause of the Cold War? Well, the Cold War was this war of ideology, a war of ideas between the United States and the Soviet Union and its satellites. And Cold War refers to something short of a shooting war, although there were proxy wars. And after World War II, the Soviets, after liberating the part of Europe that Hitler had taken over, imposed communist, totalitarian, non-democratic police states on these countries against their will. Countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and East Germany, as well as swallowing the three Baltic states into the Soviet Union itself. And characteristics of communism as seen in Eastern Europe in the 20th century. Communism in Europe is characterized by one-party, non-democratic governments that will take over agriculture through collectivization, will nationalize the means of production, the takeover of schools, the attack on religion, especially the Christian church, the teaching of atheism. And under communism, no civil liberties, no free speech, no free press, no freedom of assembly. You have arrests without trial, and you can't travel freely, even within countries. And you have, under communism, the norm. Under arrest, torture, and prison, and in the Soviet system, these work camps around the country, especially in Siberia, called gulags. How did the West work to stop the spread of communism in Europe and outside of Europe? Well, in Europe, you have things like the NATO military alliance. You have the Marshall Plan, which puts money into Europe to help rebuild it, partly altruism and to relieve human suffering, but also definitely to tie Western Europe to the United States, to democratic free trade governments. You have the Truman Doctrine, which sends $400 million to Turkey and to Greece to stop the spread of communism. And remember, Greece is being torn apart by a civil war in which the communists do lose. You have the Berlin airlift, where the Soviets try to starve out West Berlin and by shutting off the roads and the railways that go through East Germany. And an airlift, basically Americans and Brit planes, will supply the city of over 1 million people for the duration of the blockade. Outside Europe, you have the Korean War and you have the Vietnam War, which do see European participation. You have the vow of the Americans to protect Taiwan, and you have the SEATO Alliance, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which does include the French and the Brits. What was Sputnik and how did it intensify the arms race? Well, it's an artificial satellite. It's the first satellite shot into outer space. And the implications of this is now the Soviets have the ability to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile, perhaps carrying an atomic bomb. This is 1957. What was the purpose of the Bretton Woods Conference, and what was the World Bank and the IMF? Well, the Bretton Woods Conference is 44 allied nations met after World War II to discuss regulation of the international and financial order. And the big goal here is open markets and convertible currencies, stable currencies. And the World Bank's goal is to promote economic development by providing temporary loans to low-income countries. And the IMF's purpose is to promote international monetary cooperation, to increase international trade, to keep employment high, and for exchange rate stability, and to provide loans for countries in need. So the IMF, maybe big picture here, is to lower trade barriers and the movement of capital between countries. But these are the point of Bretton Woods and the World Bank and the IMF is to promote trade, to promote the free market, to promote stable currencies and economic growth, seeing that we're all sort of economically tied to each other in the long run. What were the two purposes of the European Recovery Act, also known as the Marshall Plan? And again, this is economic revival in war-stricken Europe and to stop the spread of communism. This is 1948. This is 3 years after Hitler is defeated. So keep in mind here, when you see these video clips of cities that are bombed out, 3 years after the war, there is joblessness, there is despair, there is hunger, there is poverty, there's pulverized cities, still still digging out from the rubble and rebuilding, and the Communist Party has credibility here. They're largely, the Soviets did most of the backbreaking work in crushing the German army, and you have very large communist parties in Italy and in France, approximately a third of the voters in a free system. So there's this fear that communism has appeal to the still war-weary populations of Europe. And the Marshall Plan is tremendously successful long run. Comecon, C-O-M-E-C-O-N, is the Russian version of the Marshall Plan, and it coordinates the Eastern European economic recovery, although it's nowhere near as successful because of the inherent anti-productiveness of communism itself. What were the 1956 crises? The first one is the Suez Canal crisis, and that is where Nasser of Egypt nationalizes the canal, and the Israelis and the French and the British all invade. The Israelis because Nasser is shutting the canal down to them. He's blockading the Sea of Aqaba. And the Brits because they had basically an agreement to run the canal into the 1960s. And the French because Nasser is supporting the Algerian rebels in the civil war that's going on in Algeria. French, not even a colony really, technically part of France at this time. In Hungary you have Imre Nagy, who is the leader of Hungary, permitting a certain amount of free speech and protest, and protests break out into mass protests in Budapest, and there is the talk by Nagy of pulling Hungary out of the Warsaw Pact, and this is unbearable to the Soviets, and the Warsaw Pact, basically Soviet troops and tanks, roll into Prague, and they crush the revolution here, the Hungarian Revolution, and Nagy is arrested, tried, convicted, and he is executed. The Brezhnev, I'm jumping ahead here to 1968 in Czechoslovakia. So you have the Suez Canal crisis, you have the Hungarian Revolution, and the invasion by the Warsaw Pact. And the third thing is in Poznan, Poland, you have a strike against low wages, and inflation, which is driving up the cost of food, leads to a protest in this industrial city, Poznan, Poland, and a violent crackdown ensues by the communist government. But you see an interesting thing here. Wages are increased, and a more moderate communist government is put in place under a guy named Władysław Gomulka. So you have, again, but it's a crackdown, but followed by some meager compromise here. The purpose of Khrushchev's secret speech upon coming to power after Stalin's death in 1953 is he condemns Stalin's crimes against socialism. He condemns Stalin's cult of personality. And the purpose here is to allow internal criticism, to allow a refocus on the goal of communism itself, and that is to provide a better life for the Soviet people. So Khrushchev's goal here is to refocus the communist economy not so much just exclusively on capital goods, things like hydroelectric dams and cement plants and steel factories, but to provide more consumer goods for the Soviet population. What was the '68 Prague Spring and its outcome? This is under Alexander Dubček, the leader of Czechoslovakia. He's allowing free speech, he's allowing free press and travel, and protests break out in Prague, and another Soviet invasion ensues. Dubček is, another name for his Prague Spring is socialism with a human face. And the Brezhnev doctrine is Leonid Brezhnev sends the troops in to crush the Prague Spring. The Brezhnev doctrine is the statement by the Soviets that they have the right to intervene to protect communist regimes from rebellion. What was détente under Richard Nixon? It's this idea of peaceful coexistence. Not that we're going to, like the communists, agree with them or stop resisting them, but to reduce tensions. And you have the SALT I Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty reducing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. You have some symbolic things like the Apollo-Soyuz space missions, where you have cosmonauts and astronauts linking up and shaking hands and doing experiments and eating each other's food in outer space. And these are hugely symbolic reductions in the tension. You have also scientific and artistic missions and visits going back and forth. And finally, in 1975, under Ford and Brezhnev, you have the Helsinki Accords, which is an agreement that the borders in Europe post-World War II now are sacrosanct, and the Soviets agree to respect human rights. And this is going to be a hammer to hit them with later under Gorbachev when he loosens up. When we do get to Mikhail Gorbachev, and he follows the death of Brezhnev with a very brief sort of interregnum where you have for about a year, you've got this guy named Yuri Andropov who dies, and then you have another guy who dies after a year named Konstantin Chernenko. You don't need to know them. They're basically just sort of extensions of the hard policy of Brezhnev. Gorbachev's goal is, again, like Khrushchev's, to revitalize, to breathe life into the communist economy. And he has two terms which you need to know. Perestroika, which is restructuring of the economic system, allowing some free enterprise, maybe shades of the NEP of Lenin. And Glasnost is free expression, some free speech and press and assembly. And communism falls in the USSR for a number of reasons. One is Gorbachev pulls the cap out, lets the genie out of the bottle, the genie of freedom. He is going to allow protests. He's going to allow free speech and press, and he doesn't restrict this. And he allows elections first within the Communist Party, and then he allows free elections for the Soviet Congress here. There's disillusionment with Afghanistan. You've got about 10,000 Soviet troops here come back dead, and there's low morale in the Soviet military. And it's been argued that the arms race was basically just unwinnable by the Soviets. They could not produce the weaponry, and they could not match what Reagan was producing, especially this SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative of laser zapping, missile zapping satellites in outer space, which, by the way, never did get built. But the Soviets, thought we could do it. And so you have also coal strikes. And you have the rebellion of what's called the Outer Empire. You have the Eastern European states are going to rebel, and then you have, starting in Lithuania, you're going to have rebellion in the Soviet republics themselves. And they are all eventually going to, one by one, including Russia, pull out of the Soviet Union. So collectively, Gorbachev, when he allows freedom, pursues its own end, and that is to be free, not just to pursue it. How did Gorbachev differ from Stalin? Gorbachev is, he allows freedom. He releases dissidents. He allows free speech. And Stalin is this, this guy who raises a cult of personality around himself, and he executes people by the millions who are even possible contenders. And he very rigorously collectivizes and nationalizes, pursues these 5-year plans, which are guided by Gosplan. And, the very opposite here with Gorbachev, who's allowing economic and political freedom. And remember the inner versus the outer empire. Inner empire are the 15 republics that are basically forced into this federal union of the USSR, and the outer empire are those states, those communist countries that are forced into the orbit of the Soviet Union by the imposition by the Red Army staying behind and imposing communism. What was Solidarity originally, and what did it change into? Well, Solidarity started out as a labor union at the Gdansk shipyard, which goes on strike, and it's going to change into a mass political movement. There's going to be strikes across the country, protesting poor economic working conditions and the lack of consumer goods, the lack of food and such. The leader is a guy named Lech Walesa, and it's the spelling here doesn't sound at all like Valensa. It's Walesa. It looks like Walesa. But Lech Walesa is the leader, and he's going to eventually be jailed, but once he's let out after communism falls, he'll run, and he'll become the first elected leader of a former communist regime in Europe. How did Pope John Paul II accelerate the fall of communism? Well, remember, he's the first non-Italian pope in over 400 years, and he's Polish. And he is going to be reluctantly allowed to come visit his native country, and he is going to publicly challenge the regime. And millions of people are going to watch him on TV. They're going to watch him in person as he travels around the country doing public masses. And remember, this is an officially atheistic regime which has persecuted the church. and you're going to have people saying we have no king but Jesus by the millions, and it's rather remarkable, the religious power here in pulling the rug out from under Poland. It's been argued that freedom begins in Poland before it begins anywhere else behind the Iron Curtain. 1989, East Berlin, the Soviets under Gorbachev stopped supporting repression, and when the Eastern German cities see protests in their cities, there's no support by the Warsaw Pact or the Soviets, and eventually here in '89, there's going to be protesters standing on the wall, and you're going to get some big earth-moving equipment starting to knock the wall down, and there's going to be a flood of East Germans crossing into West Germany. And within a year, in 1990, Germany will be reunited under Helmut Kohl. He will take the East German mark and swap it on par for the West German mark, which arguably was the most powerful currency in the world at that time. And you have the reintegration of East Germany into West Germany, and you have a united Deutschland once again. Examples of the rise of nationalism after 1989. Once communism is dead and buried, which is really 1991, you have, nationalism is in the USSR, all 15 republics pull out. Soviet Union becomes a non-existent state through implosion. You have the disintegration of Yugoslavia into civil war. You have the Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Macedonia all pull out, leaving Serbia behind, and even Serbia will see the southern province of Kosovo split off. Then you have Czechoslovakia. You have the Slovaks leaving. You have what's called the Velvet Divorce, and you have the Slovaks creating their own country with the capital of Bratislava. So now you have the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. Why was there violence in Yugoslavia after 1991? You did not have violence anywhere else in Eastern Europe with the exception of Romania, where Ceausescu ordered his secret police to fire on the crowds, and he's hunted down and killed along with his wife. But elsewhere, just incredibly peaceful transition. Yugoslavia sees a guy named, the president of Yugoslavia, he's a Serbian. His name is Slobodan Milosevic. He inflamed very deliberately Serbian nationalism, and he sent the army, the Yugoslav army, under basically Serbian leadership to attack the secessionist provinces. First Slovenia, which got its freedom within about 10 days or so, then Croatia, which you saw population expulsions both directions of Croats into Serbia and Croats getting kicked out of Serbia into Croatia, and Serbs getting kicked out of Croatia into Serbia. And you have a horrible civil war goes on in Bosnia, where you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of refugees and many deaths until NATO sends troops to stop the war there. The effect of the Yugoslav wars on Europe is NATO intervention. You have hundreds of thousands of refugees, and you have this shameful dithering of Europe as there's this mass slaughter going on down in the Balkans. And in Srebrenica, in a town which is supposedly a safe zone under UN protection, you have the mass slaughter of 8,000 men are shot and buried in a mass grave. And it's this thing that is going to eventually take the Yugoslav wars out of the hands of the UN and put it under NATO, and the war does stop once basically American soldiers put boots on the ground in Bosnia. The ECSC is the European Coal and Steel Community, which is a union of 6 West European countries, and the goal here is free trade, is to revive prosperity after World War II. And this is going to eventually be transformed into the European Economic Community, nicknamed the Common Market. And there is a double purpose here, where the Europeans are uniting in the EEC, and this eventually will become the EU, the European Union today. The goal is prosperity, mutual prosperity, free trade, the reduction of tariffs, and the goal here is economic revival after a brutally destructive war, and also peace, to make sure that World War II doesn't happen again, where these countries are so tied to each other through mutual self-interest, through trade and prosperity, movement of capital and labor and goods and sales, that they won't go to war. So peace and prosperity, the two reasons for the ECSC, the EEC, and the EU, which are all in this timeline in integration of European economies. The Maastricht Treaty is going to create the European Union and is going to create the euro as a common currency, although it's not used in every single EU country. For example, Great Britain always kept the pound. The Schengen area is an area that mostly overlaps the EU, but not entirely. There's some countries that are not in the European Union that are part of the Schengen. What's the Schengen? The Schengen is an area where there's free movement. You can just cross the border. And I tell the story, when I was, I've been to Europe a number of times. I've twice crossed from Spain into France, or sorry, France into Spain and back. First time, went through customs control. Second time, just got on a train in France, and I got off the train in Spain, and there I was. I mean, it's just like traveling in the United States, where you cross state borders without any impediment to movement. So the EU allows Europeans to work in each other's countries, to sell goods as if there are no borders. And the goal is kind of United States of Europe. It's sort of the plan. Current EU problems. You have millions of refugees, many of them refugees and immigrants. The difference between the two are refugees that are fleeing for their lives, fleeing persecution, fleeing warfare, fleeing perhaps a natural disaster. And the immigrants are coming over for economic, just to have a better life economically. And they're fleeing in particular the civil war that has been ripping Syria apart, but also from other places like Afghanistan and Iraq and the African countries, both Black Africa and Muslim Arab Africa, have been sending millions of refugees basically into Greece and into Italy, where the goal is to go farther north, where there's more prosperous countries, to get asylum, to get jobs, to make a better life. You have bankruptcy in what are called the pig countries, and not so much an insult, but as an acronym that's easy to remember: Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. You have these countries basically have spent themselves into bankruptcy, with the exception of Ireland, which is basically a banking problem of too many bad loans. But the issue then is, what do you do when a country that's using the euro can't pay its debts? And you've seen these massive bailouts, in particular for Greece, which has been utterly economically irresponsible. You have the issue of Brexit. Great Britain, a few years ago, voted to leave the European Union, and they're in the process of negotiating what sort of deal they'll get now that they're not in the European Union. You have issues of sovereignty. How much can the European Union, boss the member states around? How much sovereignty has been transferred to a European Union? And the issue that drove Great Britain out is essentially this unrestricted movement of people, including immigrants. These millions of illiterate, many of them with no skills, many of them, they don't speak the language. They're backing up in Italy and Greece, and the EU has said, hey, everybody's got to take their share of these refugees. And Great Britain basically has said, no, they won't. They're quitting, thus the term the British exit, Brexit. And you have the issue of Turkey. Turkey is a majority Muslim country. Turkey has, since the attempted coup, has seen President Erdogan crack down and essentially become a dictator. He's put tens of thousands of people in jail. He's put everybody who's not just a coup plotter, but also those who have been his political foes. And so Turkey is not democratic. Turkey is Muslim. Turkey has a pro-Islamic leader who an anti-secular state, and Turkey also persecutes its Kurdish minority, persecutes its Christian minority, totally denies they killed 1.5 million Armenians and killed about 500,000 Assyrian Chaldean Christians, denies that they killed about 500,000 Greeks right after World War I. So you have a very problematic country, which technically, because of its toehold in Europe and in Istanbul, arguably is a European country, technically, and they have asked to get into this European Union. And at this point, it doesn't look like Turkey's coming in. By the way, Turkey also, in the 70s, invaded a sovereign nation, Cyprus, and took off the top part of Cyprus and has made a northern Turkish Cypriot state, which is Muslim. So just some things to think about here for the test. Know the stuff, and you'll do great. Signing out.